privatization. That's the big topic I would like to discuss now, and also about different private partnership, public partner ownership, and what we really can do in order to win this debate for more privatizations. But if we cannot win on privatization, at least to a more decent state ownership. That's also a very important factor. I have, maybe you see, my heroes from the 80s and the 90s. That's also to be very clear where I come from. I'm very much for private ownership. I want to thank these four heroes I have put here forward, who have really transformed the economy of the Western world, of Western Europe, and of the North America in the 80s and 90s. And they have, with these courageous reforms, Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Helmut Kohl, they have really lived it, with the strategic clarity, with NATO double decision to rearm Western Europe, but also with the economic reforms of liberalization, of privatization, of opening the economies, of deepening the internal market, of making Western Europe work again. They have really made sure that we could create such a disparity, such a prosperity differential between the Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc and Western Europe that ultimately the Eastern system crushed, because the people were no longer ready to live under such a deprivation, and so they saw the prosperity in television in Western Germany, in television in Eastern Germany, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Czech Republic, along the whole iron curtain, the Cold War border in Europe. They saw what is possible, and they wanted to have the same, because it was so striking, the difference. And that exactly after the morosity of the terrible 70s, these were the leaders who in the beginning of the 80s came to power in Germany, UK, America, and there were others in other countries, but that was the most important leaders who really opened the economies, and they privatized it. They ended this kind of collusive, corporatistic, kind of crony capitalist system, which we had for much too long in Western Europe. Even when we were part of the free world, we made much too many compromises on state ownership, because that was popular, and that was the consensus necessary. It was difficult to convince anybody for privatization. And sadly, today again we are in a situation where state ownership seems to be really popular. After the global financial crisis, we have a huge increase of state ownership of the corporate sector. And we have this huge increase of public wealth funds, mostly from Asia and from Arabia, but also from Norway. And we have this kind of big investment funds owned by states. We have not had a lot of privatizations since 2008 of big state companies. Maybe some, but not too many. And we have really lost a little bit the direction on that one when it comes to privatization. I admire, for example, that is a very good aspect in Ukraine now, that they really start to privatize things. And America, anyhow, was never such a state-owned corporatistic model. So there was less of a need. And UK can also, in a way, relax, because they have privatized a lot already. There's now even a tendency to nationalize things. And now in Corona, we see anyhow a lot of discussions about state funds buying up companies and renationalization of critical infrastructure and of all the companies which are necessary. Basically everything is critical now. And so then we have a really worrying tendency. And I would like to make this video, this presentation, to warn about that and to promote privatization, but also, if it's not possible in some areas, and then to have a Europeanization, because I talk more about the European situation and also about the Austrian situation as a concrete example. And I would like to call then for Europeanization of public companies in critical infrastructure, because it's true, we shouldn't have key companies in the hands of the Russians or Chinese, and that's something very worrying. And that's why we have to answer a number of issues here in this video. Coming to the today's situations, back from this amazing situation. We are in a crisis now. We are in this public health shock, which we got from the corona crisis, lockdown, social distance, all these things. And there are certain phases which this crisis is going. The public health situation we have, despite current re-emergence of the virus and causing panic, but more or less we have the public health situation under control because now the vaccination answer is almost ready. Approval will be in October, November in the first major vaccination companies will be approved, and that's very good. So, and also in generally, we have lived to learn. We have learned to live with this virus, and the population is, of course, much more aware of it, and social distance measures and all these things happening. So the liquidity crisis is then the second stage, because there was such a lack of demand. Then you are in this liquidity crisis, and that the states have really done, I think, very well. That's also what the state should do. There's a crisis, you help to cover this crisis. We don't have to respond with mass unemployment. And with a major economic shock, we have put this liquidity into the system. We're talking trillions here. The EU states responded with 4.2 trillion, America with even more, the UK as well. And globally, there was a lot of additional liquidity. And this was, I think, very good. But it will also result in a certain growth crisis, because we will have this kind of adaptation in 2021, and we have to somehow make everybody this economic system work again, because now 1 year there was this lack of demand. People probably not so into the labor market anymore. The companies have got a little bit out of the markets. That's a big crisis. So we have to lower taxes. We have to open the world economy, sign this Mercosur agreement, and make sure there is a good use of this additional liquidity, especially by building things. Yeah, not just subsidizing companies or nationalizing them, but really by building things, especially public infrastructure. I've made a lot of proposals on what kind of infrastructure can be done, especially in Eastern Europe. That's of course the most important. Yeah. Debt crisis, then this all results, of course, in huge additional debt levels. The exact amount of where we will be at the end of, let's say, the year 2020-21, we will see, but we will be significantly up in the GDP debt ratio. Maybe it will be 10% up. I think actually it can be closer to 110% if it's really 4.2 trillion of EU GDP. And that's, of course, a big crisis. What we will do then? Raise taxes, or lower taxes? Will we bet on growth, or will we focus on recovery of these debts by higher taxes? Obviously, I'm in favor of lower taxes, higher growth. Faster growth can deliver us a better GDP ratio again. And also, I'm absolutely for privatization of state assets where it's realistic and doable. We have a lot of state assets, the estimation 16 trillion in all EU member states together. But, that's really difficult to evaluate. And there is one study from the EU Commission, I have this number from there. But, there is huge amounts of land, public companies, infrastructure companies, energy companies, utility companies. There is a lot. And, let's start what can be sold reasonable well. Let's sell it via the stock exchange. And, when you have no opportunity, or there is no buyer, or there is public interest, which is really significant, let's Europeanize this public assets and reduce the debt level of the specific member states. I will outline exactly what I mean with that. So let's talk a little bit about this crisis management itself. There was this big moment, some called it the Alexander Hamilton moment, like in the US when they got a unified debt level and they became a state union. Of course, we are not exactly there, but we did a big step. It was historic, it was good. We shouldn't be negative about it. It was a big step forward, but it's debt. Let's not get too much enthusiastic about it. It's still debt. It has to be repaid. But it was a further step towards unity, and unity is the central point in Europe where we can really have lift much more growth potential, because we still are so divided and we are not so unified as the United States. And you see in every aspect, yeah, this is really the missing $13 trillion question, because we lack so much into the back towards the US in GDP output. And this is something we need to address. We need to address, and there must be more unity in Europe. And this was a good moment for that. I have also, it's good to remember where we have been. It's still in March, the growth prognostics in March of this year, you have to imagine, the growth prognosis of the European Commission was entirely positive. Yeah. So fundamentally, nothing is wrong with our economy. It was bent for growth. Really huge growth numbers, yeah. Not maybe extreme, but in Eastern Europe it was all 3-4% upwards in the new Central European countries, and that was really very good for 2021. So fundamentally, there's nothing wrong. It's a shock of Corona. It's additional debt, yeah, and we have to answer that with the reasonable measures. I have already, fundamentally nothing wrong. I have to maybe explain. Fundamentally, we had too much debt level already before, yeah, inherited from the global financial crisis, the last big crisis, or from basically wrong economic policy in France, Germany, and Spain, Italy, and too high taxes and too low growth, and then too big of a welfare state. And we have to really reduce that. We are now in general at about 80%. And let's see where we end up at the end of this year and next year. So what I say is, I was also from the beginning, when we go through these big redistributional efforts, which we are now doing in order to counter the Corona crisis with the SURE program, with the recovery fund, and with Next Generation, and that's all very good. I say in generally, that's what we should do. But, I think at the same time, it would have been a really much better opportunity, and it's not too late for that, to really combine that with pooling of public assets. Because why? We have much too big state sector in the member states, in the regions of the member states, and especially in Eastern Europe. A lot of the countries have privatized something, but many still have significant parts of the economy state controlled, and also in Italy especially. Italy, Austria, the whole of Eastern Europe, deeply problematic, and we have really to make sure that this crisis is also used to either privatize or Europeanize those assets. And it's entirely justified, because there's trillions now redistributed, and so these assets have to be pooled at the EIB, in a way collateralized with this debt. And then the EIB has to restructure the state assets in the assumption, and I think it's true, that the EIB is much less politicized actor. It's much more rational political actor, the European Union, and it's much less about jobs for the boys. It's much less about this region gets that, yeah, pork barrel politics. It's much more rational actor, at least I hope. So, learning from the last crisis, from 2008 to 2016, a stronger Europe, a more united Europe, a more open and enlarged Europe. If anything we can learn about how to cope with the last crisis, especially enlargement of 2004 was so beneficial in the last crisis, because this was the growth engine of unification and of carrying us for the last crisis, from Poland to Romania. That was really very good, yeah. And we had then additional specific crises, from the euro debt crisis with Greece, and the Arab Spring, the Ukraine crisis, and the Brexit crisis, but we found the answers. Yeah? We enlarged, we included, we had these new free trade agreements with Japan and Canada. We had this Juncker plan for infrastructure investment. So we are responding. We are responding by a stronger Europe, by more unity, by openness and by enlargement, but the battle is big. The battle for enlargement with Ukraine and the Balkans, with the Mercosur agreement with ASEAN, the unity in the budgetary issues. There is, of course, big battles ahead, And okay, that's the normal thing. You have to fight the protectionists and the populists and all this, wanna be in the member state protecting their collusive cartels, yeah, and corruptive networks which finances their parties and which keeps them rich. Of course, that's a battle which is ongoing, yeah. But okay, I'm optimist, and we will also manage it. And European United Public Companies can be a big tool to reduce the influence of these state collusive cartels close to the prime ministers and their vested economic interests, which are, we have seen that in Slovakia, Malta, the worst cases, Bulgaria as well, but it's also in Austria, also in Italy, also in France. Yeah? It's much less obviously in Germany, and because of history, the German state level doesn't have so many state companies. But and also they have a more competitive and more freer system than in the smaller member states, which are easier controlled by collusive political elites in cooperation with their crony capitalist structures around them. So what we can learn, we have really done the right things also in the financial crisis in some ways. I want to focus especially on what we have done in Greece. Yeah, in Greece we have helped them to stay in the euro. That's what correct. Yeah, we have helped them to somehow diffuse the debts over time, and we have asked them to also have a privatization fund. Yeah. But that's the role model, and there was a compromise between Schäuble and Tsipras then in the last moment not to do that in Germany or in Brussels, but keep it in Greece, yeah. And it's not really very big working, yeah. So what we need to do is a different model, because the idea is not to take the assets of a country and then somehow not privatize them, just have them in the new agency, and then to do a little bit of land privatization, and then have all these fantasies about the Chinese and the Russians. Yeah? Small, fragile states like the whole eastern periphery, and these are not so marketable assets often. Who really wants to, under market condition, own the Greek railway infrastructure? I mean, the whole geography of Eastern Europe is totally complicated and difficult, yeah? And so there is not this economic basis for that one. So these are obviously the state has to be in that one. And it's very important the European state, the EU, to be in one railways infrastructure system. Because then it makes sense to have a regional railway in Greece and in Bulgaria to connect everything, ensure that the goods transport from Europe to Asia goes dynamically, all is interconnected with the ports and with the airports, and then it makes a lot of sense. Yeah? So just to have a Greek privatization fund is just 30% of the truth and of the settlement. Yeah? It must be a European privatization fund at the IAB, and then exactly not to wait until somebody buys it. You can sell 10,000 land parcels in Greece, and still, the debt will not be reduced. But what you have to do is to evaluate the whole package, transport the ownership to the EIB, reduce the debts of Greece immediately in one point. Yeah? Let's say, what is the value of this Greek privatization fund? If you go in a theoretical evaluation, you say it's worth 200 billion. I honestly don't know. But then you have 300 billion of debts, and then you say, okay, it's transferred. It's now owned by all Europeans, basically, and the Greeks have a state which works again. Where they can hopefully, and then obviously please don't raise the debt level again through the roof. Yeah? That would be also good. But for this, we have already the mechanisms in the European semester and in closer supervision of the member states. So there is a mechanism for that. But we have to be a little bit courageous and transform this towards the European level. So the Greek model basically for all of them, that's what I call a debt equity swap. Yeah. Here we come with, the current debt expenditure level to GDP. You see that, for example, the benchmark should be 40, and we have France with 55% of the general expenditure is of the GDP is government expenditure. That's of course much too high. So it should be 40%. And the 40% you see, we rarely, half of the states reach it. From Poland, Spain, UK, and it's no longer, but Sweden, Estonia, and so this is rational 40%. It can be maybe 42, 45. Yeah? But all these states like Finland, France, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Italy, Belgium, yeah, Hungary, above 45, that's red flag. That is red flag. Yeah? And we should really discuss with all of them what is wrong in their expenditure system, because that translates obviously in high taxation system, that translates in low competitive and low growth system, and that's a problem for all of the European economy, especially France. So then some accuse me that I'm not for the welfare state, And I have now read also this book of Professor Aslund, and I thought in detail what is 40%, It is a very good book. I recommend it, by the way, The European Growth Crisis. And then you go really to what is this kind of peace benchmark, because I call a big mobilization of state resources, 55, that you can only justify in the time of war or threat of war. I think, a normal standard in peace times, as we live more or less today, we really have to make sure that 40% of the GDP is enough for the state on all levels and in all actors. Yeah. So it's also for the welfare system to be financed in the 777 formula. It's easy to remember. It's 28% of state GDP for the welfare system in 4 pillars: education, health, pension, and social system. So education, basically universities and education for the young and all kind of education, a health system, 7%, pension 7%, social system 7%. Yeah, that should be covering that welfare state. 28% is, we're talking huge amounts of money. Yeah, and I think that's social and decent and not more. When we have some states with 14% pension level, then they don't spend on other things like defense. Yeah, that's totally wrong. So we need the benchmark, and we need a 10 years target corridor where we really try to discuss with all the member states and all the future member states to reach this level of welfare system. It's also not good to have too less, because it means that then everybody from Romania comes to Western Europe. So basically everybody should have about the same 28 4 times 7 system, and not to save on the costs of others, because it's a bit of a free riding. And also you shouldn't be then too generous in the pension, because then the other populations say, like the German pensioners say, oh look, the Austrians have so much better, higher pension system. Yeah, because we like free riding other things. Yeah. So anyhow, so 1% debt, 1 for the regions and for regional economic development, and 1 for judiciary, police and home affairs, 1 for infrastructure, 3% for everything from environment, agriculture, climate, and the economic system, 2% on defense, 2% for the European Union governance, and 1% for global governance and international development. Yeah? That means UN, and that means also development aid. I think we should be ambitious on that one and help. So all in all, it's 40% if you come up. Yeah? Obviously, you can have a corridor for 10 years for the countries with a bigger share at the moment, and for other countries to really go to that level. But good, and it doesn't have to be, it can be 35 as well, and 45, but not 55, and also not 25. We have to find some rational factor, and this 40%, I think it's a very good and doable benchmark. It saves the welfare state long term, it makes it sustainable, it is to ensure we have all the economic and social and environmental and energy budgets, and when we have a crisis, we can temporarily increase something. It's a health crisis, it's a climate crisis. Let's adjust a little bit in that one. But then, when these things have happened and were addressed, then to get back to a reasonable 40% of GDP on expenditure. When it comes to the question now, which in 2021 will be the big debate, tax increases or selling state assets to EIB or privatize them, basically. The question is how to repay these massive new debt levels. When we really will be at 100% of GDP or 110, there's this illusionary talk about easy money and magic money that doesn't matter because we have so low inflation. Well, it's good. Yeah, we have low inflation because we are more open. We have included so many more billions of people in the global economy. We have much more freer trade. Yeah, so we have less inflationary pressure on many of the food markets, on many of the manufacturing market, on the labor market. But we see a lot in the less movable assets, basically in the assets in the richer countries, their prices are exploding already. So that's many of the factors why we have so low inflation, and we can keep interest rates low. It's very good, but definitely we have to repay the debt. And I think it's an opportunity now when we really have this crisis. Let's make sure we either sell reasonable where it can be sold on the stock exchange. Then let's sell these assets to the investing public, or sell some land and other assets to the present people who rent it. Or let's try to pool it in the European level, and then the European level can maybe partially privatize them on a much better way, and that would be very good. And the assumption that we have 16 trillion of worth of EU state assets, well, there might be different numbers. Now the UK has gone. The study I referred to was from 2016 from the EU Commission, but there might be other levels. Obviously in the 16 trillion, there must be everything calculated, like a highway system, financial system, and property, and it adds up. It adds up. The IMF says that the whole of the global state-owned enterprises, obviously there's also a big part is China, is about worth 45 trillion, the equivalent of half of global GDP. Yeah? I think really that's worrying on the one hand, but it's also a big reserve we can use now to recover and reduce the additional debt which we were taking on. Yes, the question is always critical infrastructure must be in state hands. I say no, we can really privatize also railways, also energy systems, also sensitive things, yeah, but not to the Chinese and not to the Russians or not to Iran, yeah. I mean, we must be really crazy if we then give very critical infrastructure to Russia, like in the Nord Stream 2. If we need that pipeline, buy it ourselves, buy it off Gazprom. If we really need it, good, then we can do it. We are not like a poor neighbor or somebody of Russia. We are a very rich European Union. If this Nord Stream 2 is needed, that's the assessment, then invest, then buy it, EIB, yeah, for example. But what is not possible is that the Russians, Chinese, Iranians, or any kind of other hostile state buys critical infrastructure and starts to influence especially smaller member states because they control the energy or the information technology or something like this. Yeah, I mean, we are not a banana republic as the European Union. Yeah, so critical infrastructure can be privatized, but via stock exchange to the global financial market. Yeah, and not towards a deal. I fly to Moscow like Tsipras did it. Can you buy my railway system in a quick deal? I mean, not even Russia is so crazy to do that because that's anyhow technically and financially unsustainable. So, but the thing is, we have to be smart, we have to be reasonable, rational, and responsible, and we can also allow critical infrastructure to be owned by the real private sector, not by somehow fake state actors. Yeah. I have also made a little bit of appeal towards the Austrians because, and I will talk about it a bit later, because we have a very specific history which I explain, and we can sell a lot because we have really dramatically high level of state ownership in the economy, and it's very collusive and corrupt. So how the European airlines, I will now go, for example, a European airline. Now we just had, Austria has contributed again to the Lufthansa, Austrian Airlines, and now Lufthansa is massively supported by the German state. Fine, during an emergency that might be good. The German state took some equity, but I think it would be much better if we do that on the European level. Let's have the EIB take a stake in the Lufthansa. maybe let's have even a European airline, yeah, or let's have European airports, yeah. We can do that, yeah. We can take responsibility as European Union, and it's much better. And later we can sell some stuff again. The Americans actually have served the automobile industry with this one. They made debt for equity swaps in 2008-9 with Obama, and they became a very big shareholder of General Motors, and then they sold it again. Yeah, I think this is the right level, not to keep it then permanently like the German state in Commerzbank. Yeah? The idea is not to keep that forever, but to do the equity intervention in the time of a crisis, as long as if it's reasonable and strategic and justified, not like the Vienna mayor is now doing a fund to save some jewelry company and some petrol station chain. That's nonsense, yeah. But Lufthansa can be justified, it's system relevant, and then you can really do that, but not forever. The more logical case and the more important is economically is, of course, the railway infrastructure situation. And there was a big issue about this merger of the railway suppliers, this Alstom-Siemens merger, and this was luckily rejected by the EU Commission. But what we really should do is combine the SNCF, the French state railway, and the German railway into one big European company, yeah. Hopefully, then others will join in as well with their assets and receive equity or debt reduction, depends. Like the Greek railway obviously will not have, the Greek state should not have then a share in the European railway system situation, but they will get debt relief because they have accumulated so much debt. But the Austrians, for example, can have 0.5% of a European railway company if they fancy that. And then they bring in the ÖBB into this big one. And obviously, under condition of liberalization, there is a real railway market for operators. And the infrastructure is a state-owned company European-wide, which really invests according to European real transport priorities, European-wide east, west, north, south, builds the big tunnel because which we need under the Mediterranean to connect with Central Asia under the Caspian, to really think big and do all these massive investments which is needed European-wide pooled as a continental union. I think that's a powerful and important vision. That's good for the economic recovery, and this is really something which can be easily started with the merger of SNCF and DB. And then, all other railways can then, according to the asset value of their companies, share into that. And then, this big European railway company can then make an IPO on European stock exchanges and then gradually let the private sector into it. That would be much better. And that's a powerful giant European champion, and not of which really has a very big company that would be ultimately one of the biggest in the world, and that is then the states and the EIB are owners, and then they gradually put equity on the stock exchange and invest massively, fund something like a second or third railway revolution, but European-wide. It makes no sense just to drive fast in France and Germany because they are the big markets with the big funding possibilities. But then you have already problems crossing Belgium or into Austria or Poland. That's not a continental union. That's nonsense. Anyhow, the same is for a European energy company. It can be also that, for example, one state company like EDF is the nucleus of a European energy company, but then the EIB to buy equity into it, other companies, other state energy companies to pool, to make debt equity swaps, and then to Europeanize, for example, EDF. Yeah? That is also one way. We don't have to build everything new. We can also do this kind of agreements, which are similar, and we have done that already in the defense industry. I will talk about it in a second. But then we can, for example, buy out the Rosatom from these few projects they have in Ukraine and in Finland and in Czech Republic. And the Rosatom is quite active in Eastern Europe, especially the worst one, of course, the PAX in Hungary. And don't we have a better offer and a better capacity? Can we not do that ourselves? Can ADF not do that? With funding of the EIB. So it would be much more logical for me to have our own nuclear energy. Of course, we can say we don't like it and EIB should not fund it. That's complete nonsense. The reality is the ADF operates 73 nuclear power plants. Yeah. And, then we invite the Russians, a hostile state, to do nuclear power in Hungary, Finland, and other countries. I mean, that I really cannot understand. Yeah? So then we can also, and we have done that already with the Airbus. Yeah, Airbus basically was in different state industries from Germany, France, Spain, and I think the UK and other countries which have pooled their defense and airline industries into one company. And now it's Airbus and it's quite successful. Now it's anyhow in a crisis, but they also produce a lot of defense relevant material. And that's what we have to come back again, that here the pooling of European defense industry, also including, for example, Ukraine and the Balkans, there's also defense industry there, and pool it into one big company owned by the EIB and offer these countries who are anyhow in a major debt crisis, all of them, to reduce their debt levels and to have the success of being fully integrated in the European defense industry value chain. Yeah? And then we can produce also airlines maybe cheaper. That's very good for Airbus. Also in Ukraine, for example. And then we are much more efficient and we have much better defense capacities in a kind of defense market integration as well, with such a stronger Airbus, which is also pooling more of the industrial assets. So anyhow, we will have a big divide in Europe because the bigger countries can save their industries better in the corona, and that's also not very good. Why can smaller states like Lithuania not? They will be very much limited. They cannot bail out their airlines like Germany. That's actually the reason why we have all these anti-subsidies and competition regulations, because we don't want the stronger states to be always stronger. We want to make sure that we have an equal and fair playing field between our very different sizes of economy and states. Yeah, and so we need to think about that. Also, that's more about the energy system again. In the recovery plan, I called very loudly for a European energy independence contribution that is basically taxing Russian carbon and Russian nuclear, Russian coal. We really have to get more independent. It's a way to avoid a trade war with America on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also we can reduce our dependency on Russia and finance some own resources for the European Union. And yes, I was always very supportive of the recovery plan. That's really good. Let's unite more and let's spend more taxpayers' money, but spend it wisely on infrastructure and not on just subsidizing the welfare system. So, no bailing out of shareholders of big corporates, that's what I want to make also very sure. If you are a shareholder of a company up to now and you are in a crisis, then I think it's normal that with the risk, you lose that. So not bailing out the shareholders, but buying basically into that company, taking over companies, that's really good, but not just, to kind of a corporate welfare. Why European public companies? Yes, why not simply more privatization? Some people will accuse me, this is the same if it's in Austrian state hand or in EU state's hand, and certainly that's partly true. But, we have to see where is the public consensus. Can we really get better consensus and agreement to transfer them to the EU level and later privatize them? Or is it also possible to privatize certain assets like Greek railway systems or Greek ports? Yeah, is it really so good that the Chinese state owns the Greek Piraeus airport? I don't know. Or is it good that the Russians own the pipeline system or control the pipeline system in the Nord Stream? I've made that case already. But I think we should not allow in strategic industries other state actors to own things in the European Union, and then it's better we ourselves own it in the European level. And also when there is no consensus for a privatization, it's better to have it by the EU managed than by very corrupt, collusive elites, because politicians in member states always, their focus must be jobs for the boys, and to fund their party, and they will always see these public enterprises from Croatia to Greece to everywhere to Austria, only as machines to generate jobs and revenues, which ultimately serve the party political purposes. And so, and anybody who knows the facts understands what I want to say. Yeah? So debt equity swaps are not the same like Eurobonds. We have also now started in a way Eurobonds or not. There's a big debate about that, but we started joint bond issues. So it ultimately is Eurobonds. But debt equity swaps would be much better than that, because it would be realistic and it would give us a good opportunity to have better public services as well. Yeah. Because how can really the Greek railway or the Slovenian railway or the Albanian railway or the Slovakian railway alone stem all these public investments which are required for big high-speed trains, for all these necessary investments? This is not possible without a massive European pooling of efforts. The geography of Europe and the history of Europe is like that. We are quite weak in the fragile East, yeah, and we have very difficult infrastructure with the Mediterranean, and so these are all huge things, yeah. And we have already now 3 or 4 tunnels in the Alps, yeah, and that's probably enough of tunnels in the Alps. And this wealth of the center has to be there also for big infrastructure of the periphery, and that's good for everybody. So we need to pool this into European companies. Coming up, I have just said already, the EU has released the overall figure of 4.2 trillion as Corona mobilization funding. I don't know if that's old debt or new debt. Yeah? So that would be then adding up to 15 trillion, because currently we are at 11 trillion of government debt. Yeah? And we have 14 trillion of GDP in the year 2019. So yeah, let's see, probably the GDP will be lower this year, and then the final number of the debt when it's really then adding 15 billion. So we would be at 110 if I'm correctly calculating, and that's of course very big. So really we have to think about it. And I would like now to discuss about the Austrian case, especially because it's the one I know best, because I'm from Austria. But Austria is a very specific country. We have a long tradition of state ownership, reaching back from the moment when the Austrian state was declared after the end of First World War, when basically the whole Habsburg land ownership was nationalized, and so 10% of the Austrian landmass is in the company Bundesforste. And then after the Second World War, there was a lot of industry built by the Nazis in the occupied times after Anschluss, and that was all then nationalized in order to get it out of the question of recompensation. And then obviously Austria did just a few privatizations until the breakdown of the state industries in 85, and then a little bit in the first years when we joined the European Union, but a little bit. And then was this big change of Austrian government, you might remember, very controversial, to work with the populists and nationalists together. And the promise was that once we work to do that, we will really do a lot of privatization, we will change Austria. The pain to work with these populists is justified by really making wide-reaching reforms. Yeah? That was the theory about it, and something happened. There was partial privatization of state energy company Verbund of Austria and Post, partial privatization, and also the steel company was privatized. And there was some progress. Yeah? I don't want to say there was nothing on that one, but when you look, and I have now here in the second one, this is the list of the Austrian state companies owned by the federal authorities on the national level in just the state industry holding. It's still the Post, still the Verbund Energy, casinos, OMV, very problematic energy giant in Austria, telecom, and billions and billions of property and financial kind of investments from the financial crisis, and other things of the mining industry. But that's by far not all. Whenever that's already 22 billion. Then we have the regional energy companies, 9 regional energy companies. I have just 2 logos here. Then we have the railway company, we have the motorway company, and we have this big land owning and forest company, And then every single of the regional authorities still has 9 regional entities, which are their holding companies, which have massive investments in kind of from ski lifts, ski resorts, public transport utilities, subway systems, these energy systems and utility systems and computer backbone systems. There is so much in Austrian state hand today, and we went through all this pain. And when you look 20 years later, we have some cosmetic improvements, but basically the whole Austrian collusive, corrupt systems of crony capitalism is still one of the biggest in Europe, when supposedly we are the free Western country. And now really it's time to reduce that. And it's really massively time to reduce that. And I hope that now there will be the moment where, under the pressure of the corona debt, there will be the moment to reduce this. Yeah? Obviously, it's not all perfect, because we have to prepare our institutions for the next phase of market economy, of more freedom and more capital market, because we don't have a working financial security exchange commission like in the US. We have very collusive systems in Germany and Austria, and we have no kind of supervision of money laundering that worth speaking of. We are just in the last 3 months, the German and Austrian authorities were hit by the Wirecard scandal, a publicly owned company, listed company, even on the DAX, which was fully corrupt and a big disaster for the investors. We have the Odebrecht scandal now recently coming up. In Austria, also one bank taking 20 years already in bankruptcy, but really in business, continuing every single day. And that is really a sign that we need a better institutions in terms of countering money laundering. Manafort I put here nicely as well, because he was also laundering a lot of money. And you see how wrong this is, that we don't have the right institutions in the European level, because our member states and their collusive relation always depending with the jobs on the prime ministers and the political majority. And then they of course look away when they have the impression that this is something of the state request. And then it's all very negatively, unfortunately. And we need European institutions like a SEC, like the FinCEN, but with power in the European Union. There's a lot of proposals, and we have to really prepare the institutions for the next wave of privatizations. And let me just a little bit come up to this beautiful chart. It's a bit complicated. If you have still attention, you see exactly how the EU has measured the whole countries and how much of the revenues of the whole economy is in state hand. In Austria it's 5%, in Slovenia 12%. How much of the value added of the whole economy is in state hands? So in Slovenia 5.6, yeah. So it's quite, and how much of the market capitalization is of the economy, of the whole economy, is in state companies, majority owned state companies. 14% in Austria, 36% in the Czech Republic, Finland 12.13%, Hungary 20%, Italy 12%, Poland 18%, Romania 22%, Slovenia 35%. Yeah, so really we have a problem here in Europe, in the post-communist parts, in Italy and Austria, but all over it's really quite problematic. Yeah. And when it comes to my closing, yes, these were the heroes of the past. They have delivered victory in the Cold War. Now really it's time for another generation of leaders to be brave enough to bring companies to the stock exchange, to sell it and to reduce the debt level and to stimulate the economy, create the right institutions for that. And also, if it's critical infrastructure, if it's justified, Europeanize, bring it to the EIB, make sure we have a European railway giant, we have a European energy giant, we have a European banking giant. It is possible, yeah. We can do that, yeah. And it's ideological as well justified to have a European railway, a European energy, a European highway company, a European port company. We can later then gradually put 10%, 15, 20, 49% on the stock exchange. But, maybe in the strategic parts like energy, highways, and so to keep 51%, but on the European level, and really have a massive European infrastructure campaign and not give it to the Russians or Chinese or anybody, and really help to build this necessary reconstruction of Eastern European infrastructure connectivity to connect the European continent with Africa, with Asia, bypassing hostile Iran and hostile Russia, and really get going with a decent overall holistic infrastructure strategy funded by such big companies. And then we can also compete globally, and we have also the possibility to reduce the normal taxation level on income on corporation tax, which is of course for ETR very important, because for the recovery we need lower taxes, and you cannot burden the private sector now with all this corona debt in terms of higher taxes, because that would be a strategic mistake, because again we would be weaker in the growth of the recovery than America and other parts of the world, and we will fall more behind. Like after the GFC, we have already significantly lagged behind. You can see the other video I made on that one, behind the US in the recovery GDP per capita, and we shouldn't do that again. We have to learn from the past mistakes and really focus on private sector recovery in the 2020s, and to do privatization where it's useful and doable, and a lot of sectors, but then in the big infrastructure sectors to Europeanize in order to reduce collusion, corruption, and crowning capitalism in the southern and eastern European member states, including Austria, and really have more European transparency and accountability and productivity on these very important sectors, which will hopefully lead the recovery for the next decade. Thanks a lot.